right, so this is, again, I'll lose track. I think this is week 10. And we're doing Ernest Gaines of Love and Dust. And I'm joined by Dr. Jennifer Morrison. And I forget where you're at. You're at Southern University in New Orleans, right?
Yes.
Right. And Jennifer and I both got our PhDs at the University of Louisiana Lafayette. And we actually both worked at the Ernest J. Gaines Center, which houses his archives and is dedicated to his life and work. So we spent a lot of time working on Gaines and reading Gaines extensively and everything. And the essay that you're reading this week, The Politics of the Plate, is actually by Jennifer. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and this is, truth be told, this is the first time I've taught this novel. I know, and maybe we can talk about this first. Typically, if I teach Gaines, it's a gathering of all men or something like that, which I spoke with you about last semester. But this is probably my favorite Gaines novel. And I think it's yours too. Am I right about that?
Mm-hmm.
And I actually put out on Twitter the other day too, after I finished rereading it. And this sounds really like hyperbole to me, but I don't know, that it's one of the most important novels of the 20th century.
Well, I think it is, and I think it's probably one of it's to me it's his best, or one of his best. I mean, I'm not going to say it's his best. I had recently read A Lesson Before Dying, and it impressed me again, as being just really an amazing novel. So I go back and forth. But in regards to being really important, I do think it is very important because um, just like Gaines's very sophisticated understanding of Southern dynamics, and his just kind of like his ability to sort of articulate the artistry of like what it feels like to actually live in that space and respect the culture and the way people interact in that space. You and I have discussed many times about how committed he is to the oral tradition and establishing like how people actually communicate and understand information and understand how to live on a plantation and in the Southern structure for Black people and white people. So, and also his understanding of the dynamics between subcultures like Black people, white people, Creoles, Cajuns, the nuances of those identities. I know that's something that you learned by living in South Louisiana, being someone from North Louisiana, kind of like having to learn those dynamics and navigate those dynamics, right?
So can we slow down real quick, and can you explain this? So I'm from North Louisiana.
Yeah, you
So
are.
Shreveport Bossier area. I don't want to hear that. I
Mm-hmm.
claim South Louisiana for 7 years. I mean, I
Yeah.
can semi-claim it. But it's extremely different than South Louisiana. When you think of Louisiana and you don't live in Louisiana, you think of Cajuns, you think of New Orleans, right? Typically you go to New Orleans, then you think of Cajun culture. And Cajun culture, of course, from what I learned moving down there to get my PhD, is west of Baton Rouge, basically. Right. And then Creole is New Orleans, and other is kind of east of Baton Rouge. And this takes place kind of in that middle ground, right outside of Baton Rouge. Point QP, where the parish that Gaines writes about, is kind of northwest of Baton Rouge area. And they go into Baton Rouge in this novel. So the thing that we need to kind of break down, which you break down a little bit in your piece, and Maria Aber-Leiter does it in her piece that's referenced in yours, is these hierarchies. Because you see, and you talk about this, where Bonbon's talked about as white, but he's Cajun.
Right.
There's a big distinction between Cajun and wealthy or white. And then a distinction between white, Cajun, mixed race or Creole, however we want to define Creole, and then Black, right? So can you talk about that just a little bit? Because Gaines deals with this in all of his works.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that you sort of, so the idea of like a racial dynamic between Black and white becomes complicated with class a lot, and ethnicity. So what you see is that you have distinctions between white and Black people, right? And those in that hierarchy is also influenced by class consciousness. And in of Love and Dust, the white man, if you will, is named Marshall Hebert. And if you're from the area, Hebert is a French Cajun last name. And so in some ways, when I was reading it, even I've read this book first when I was 12. So I've been reading this book for years. I remember thinking Marshall Abair, if I hear that name and I think about Bon Bon, I'm not thinking that they're that different. The only thing that differentiates them to me would be the access to power. Like Marshall Abair obviously has money and Bon Bon obviously doesn't have as much money. That's the thing. But he's coded as white and thus powerful. And it doesn't seem to be like a cultural difference. It seems to be like a class, money, access difference. And so I thought that was really interesting. And then you get like, so Marshall Aber is not talked about as if he's a Cajun, whereas
Right.
the Cajun moniker is just Latin onto Sidney Bomba. Like he's a Cajun, and it's said multiple times.
And
With
Marcus's comment.
Marcus's comment, Aunt Margaret saying, the Cajuns on the river, who are associated with Bump are going to start some mess. We know that Louise is also Cajun. We understand. So they are coded as Cajun repeatedly throughout the text in ways that Marshall Abair, last name being Abair, me being from that area, know good and well, like that's a very Cajun last name. He is not coded as that. And the only reason I see that happening is because he runs things. And so he's sort of like has almost opted out or moved out of that Cajun identity by virtue of class status, which I think is really interesting. And that's something that I didn't quite process, when I first read it. And I'm thinking about it now, that was really odd to me that he was coded as white when, if you're from the area, you hear that name and you wouldn't necessarily do that. Secondly, not in this book, there's not a lot of emphasis on like Creole identity in the way it is in A Lesson Before Dying and in say
Catherine
Caroline
Cormier.
Cormier. Yeah, Catherine Cormier. There's a lot more emphasis on that identity, but you understand that there's also this distinction between blackness. And I use the term blackness sort of because that's kind of how we can enter into that discussion. But there is a discussion about what constitutes what blackness is and isn't. We understand that Creoles, at least, culturally, like colloquially, and are just like understanding them socially, but also in the context of Gaines's work, their proximity to blackness and their acceptance of their blackness is also, it ranges, right?
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that we see we don't see it in this book, really, we don't really see a discussion of like Creole culture,
No, we
really.
don't. We see it. We see it in Lesson and Cormier and Gathering. But
Yeah.
what one thing, quick side note too. There are a couple of things that I wanted to say. But if you read older stuff, students, Creole means something different than it does within Gaines's context.
Right.
Initially, it meant immigrants from France or Spain, colonists into Louisiana. So if you read George Washington Cable, if you read Frank Yerby, earlier, 20th century, 19th century stuff, that's what it means. Here, it means specifically mixed race.
Right. And it's really interesting because, that term, like that's a whole discussion, right? What Creole means, because in some ways what Creole means, like to your point, it's a Creolization of culture. And so it does kind of mean mixed race, but it also means mixed culturally, right? And so, but in Gaines's work, it is taken to mean people who phenotypically register as mixed race and segregate themselves and associate based on not only cultural aspects that are distinctly French and African American, but also phenotypically they register as people who are mixed race. And so what you have, and in real life, that's actually more complicated, right? So the area where this takes place and also the area where we attended grad school, you have a lot of heavily influence of French culture on all cultures. But mainly on the African American culture, you have this combination, or like you could say a creolization of culture between French culture and African American culture. So you have a lot of Black people who have a lot of traditions that mimic those of their Cajun neighbors, right? And so what happens is, but that's not necessarily defined by a phenotypical difference from other Black people. But in Gaines's work, the Creoles are defined by not only, worshiping, most of them are Catholic. They may eat food that is closely associated with French culture and things of that nature. But a lot of their identity is predicated on the fact that they look a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not, and I want to emphasize here, that's not necessarily the case in real life, but for Gaines in his sort of like fictive universe, that's how that identity works.
And there's a couple of things you said there. I want to back up for a few things. One is that discussion of mixed race and mixed culture. And that's not new, because one of the other important aspects of this book that I think needs to be talked about with this text and with others of this period, this came out the same year as Loving versus Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
So the Supreme Court case with Mildred and Richard Loving that struck down, miscegenation laws, and paved the way, well, it didn't pave the way, struck down those laws and allowed interracial couples to marry, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a good book called Loving by Cheryl Cashin, which details a lot of this. And she talks about the area where they were, that it was very mixed with Native American, Indigenous, African American, and white. So much intermingling, you couldn't necessarily tell who was what.
Right.
And I'm reading a book now called I forgot the name of it. It's by Elizabeth McCrae, but it's dealing with it's Mothers of Mass Resistance, which deals with white women and they're upholding white supremacy. And in one of the opening chapters talks about that area in Virginia and the Racial Integrity Act of 1921 in Virginia, and about individuals saying they're Black, saying they're white, the government coming in saying they're Black or white in such different forms. And Mildred even, I think, identified as Native American at some points and as Black at other points, right? So that slippery nature, and that's within South Louisiana, there's a unique aspect. Within Virginia, there's a unique aspect, but it just shows you the slipperiness of these types of things.
Right. Well, and in real life, right? They're very slippery, and it's hard to nail it down. I mean, do you remember when we did the Institute? I think not the first year, but the second year of the LEH funding, we had a professor, I believe she was from Nichols, and she was a French professor, and she said that when you say Creole, that's very specific. That's a very specific culture, and it traces itself to very specific French expressions of culture. What she said, that the area we're from, which is Lafayette Parish, Acadiana, which takes its name from the Acadians, which mean, these are the people who came down from Canada, Nova Scotia, and settled South Louisiana, and then became known as Cajuns. That's a very specific type of French culture that is not Creole culture from France. Because as you noted, Creole culture was privileged. These are like the sons and daughters of French nobility who settled in the New World. And because France has very strict laws about who can be a citizen, once you are not born in France, you don't count as a French citizen in that way, and you're culturally something different. And so that was those people called Creoles, and they have a culture that's also mixed with Black culture that is very specific to certain areas, like we talked about in New Orleans, obviously where I'm located, and also in that Natchitoches area, that is like kind of Creole. The people who settled where we're from, the Cajuns, their culture is not the same as this French nobility, right? And so what you have here is like a group of people who have a very specific experience and expression of French culture who are white, and they mix with those Black people. And so what the professor from Nichols was saying was that French, the dialect and the way the French is spoken and the way the culture is expressed, the Black people are actually technically not Creole, they're French, they're Black Cajuns, which blew my mind in some ways, but seemed very obvious in others, right? It seemed pretty clear. And then one way you can also tell is by people's last names. Like some last names are Creole and some are Cajun and some are, it's like very specific. And so I found that also very fascinating. But I say that to say that in the world of fiction, in Gaines's fiction, what he's really trying to get at is what is Blackness, what is whiteness, and what is that liminal space between. So what you were talking about, that's completely, that happens in Chicago, that happens in North Virginia, that happens all over the place. But fictively, like in his fiction, I think he's trying to get at a sense of liminality when it comes to race. And he's using Creoles, and I would argue even Cajuns, to sort of articulate the slippery nature of race and the slippery nature of like identity. Like, okay, what does it mean to be white? And what does it mean to be white but not quite? What does it mean to be black? And
Right.
and what does it mean to have black ancestry but not be completely engaged in black culture? And I think he's, and so if in real life it doesn't exactly play out that way, that's okay. But like in fiction, I think he's really trying to get at some of these ideas.
Well,
Um,
what does it mean to be white, not quite, as Bonbon? Because the other thing I kept
right.
thinking about when you were talking is the book shows those hierarchies, because remember that discussion of Bonbon maybe a couple of times with Jim saying, he's treating us basically the same,
Mm-hmm.
right? Trying to
Mm-hmm.
draw those connections, and Jim's basically like, nope.
Yeah.
you
Well,
know,
I thought that was really interesting because I think, so Bonbon has that epiphany, and that's his epiphany, right? We've talked about that. Like, what does it mean for a character to have an epiphany? And then, like, for us outside of the text to witness that, see that, and process that. But for Bonbon, like, that's a mind blowing thing. Like, wait, I'm being treated, we're all similar. And like you said, Jim's response is like, okay, like, not
right?
really.
He's like, I have access to whiteness, but I'm not white.
Right. But
White.
the thing about Bonbon that's really interesting to me is, in the second, well, not the second, but this time around when I was reading it and going through it, what I really noticed was the juxtaposition between Bonbon and Marcus and how similar
They
they were.
are.
Oh yeah, they are. They're very
And
similar.
I think,
Go ahead.
but I was about to say, a lot of what I noticed when I read this, I want to hear about how you think they're similar, but I notice the dueling relationships, because
Mm-hmm.
both of those relationships start and are steeped in the cultural kind of stereotypes and ideas and rules, as Gaines calls them,
Mm-hmm.
specifically with Bon and Pauline being like, I can take her whenever I want to, right? The
Mm-hmm.
violence against Black women. And he takes her in the field, and then she uses him, but then
Mm-hmm.
they fall in love.
Mm-hmm.
Marcus is doing the same thing with Louise. She's the white woman on the pedestal because she's presented as a ghost, as a kind of this spectral figure. And there's other moments where she's kind of talked about and elevated,
Mm-hmm.
but she's kind of this myth figure that's not there. She doesn't really seem to exist and have herself, right?
Mm-hmm.
But he violently attacks her. So he's playing into that stereotype of the aggressive sexual black male who's raping her, even though she's going along with it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they both end up loving each other and caring for each other. And you see genuinely that Bon cares for Pauline, and you see genuinely that Marcus cares for Louise, and vice versa with the
Mm-hmm.
women too. So I think
Well,
that that's a really important thing too. And the key too, as well, is that these things can't survive
right.
because the rules in the society won't allow them to.
Well, one of the things I thought about in reading it again and engaging with it again was how much Gain seems invested in making these characters not be stereotypes, not be archetypes in
Yeah,
that
they're
way.
not.
And he challenges it as he presents it to you. So one of the things I think that was really interesting that he did with all of them. So we'll go through all four, right? So with Bonbon, he's Bonbon is supposed to be this, rough and tumble white guy who is obviously racist, obviously terrorizing all the people on the plantation, right? And he's an overseer,
Right.
essentially. He's an overseer. And yet he's really close friends with Jim. He's not really culturally tied or even really tight with his family. And they talked about how he's isolated from the Cajuns on the river, even though he goes fishing with them and everything. He doesn't really feel a close allegiance to them. He's stealing from the white man who's above him. So he doesn't really seem to have a really close allegiance to whiteness itself. He's cheating on Louise. He takes care of his daughter, right? He loves her,
And
but for
takes
the
care
most
of Billy and
part,
Willie too.
well, but his allegiance to whiteness itself is really loose. All
Yeah.
his intimate close relationships are with black people: Pauline, his children, Safer Teat, and Jim. So in some ways, he is the image of this white man who is supposed to honestly be a Klan member and be brutal towards black people and be loyal to whiteness and steadfast to that. But honestly, his behavior does not show that at all. The person he steals from is the people he betray are white people
Well,
in a lot of ways.
isn't
Yeah.
that that's fixing a gathering of all men? not the exact same, but Gaines does that with Fix. I think he makes you feel more sympathetic with Bon Bon. I'll say that.
Yeah.
But he
Yeah.
makes you feel he makes you feel sympathetic with Fix in there, because the first time you see him is when he's grieving the loss of his son, the murder. Um, that's one of the things that Gaines does really well. Like you said, he's not presenting binaries for you.
No.
He's not doing a Richard Wright.
No, no, he's not. And I just read Long Black Song, and that's like really thinking about that. But
Is that the one with the traveling salesman? I forget which one.
yeah, yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that yeah. But
I
anyway,
do like the way he uses songs in there though and cuts them off. That's one of
yeah.
the discussions. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, and so when you think about Bon Bon sort of like being presented to you in a very specific way, but him sort of challenging that idea, then you look at Pauline, and she's this black woman. She works as a cook. She's on the plantation, and she goes into her relationship with Bon Bon thinking basically like, I'm gonna get what I can out of this guy, because he obviously is going to be um coercing me or approaching me, and I just might as well make the best out of it. And it talks about how she starts to care for him
Mm-hmm.
and develop real feelings, and they develop a family. But it also describes her as, which is really interesting, the most desirable woman on
Mm-hmm.
the
I
plantation.
noticed that too.
And then also, which is also really interesting for Gaines, which is a whole other conversation, he makes this remark. Marcus sees her and he comments on her looks. And I'm always attuned to this because Gaines is very, very, very um color conscious, if you will. Like
Mm-hmm.
he's extreme, like he comments on the color of the characters, especially the black characters, because that's important in your if you're thinking about the construction of Louisiana society. And as you noted with Creoles, he's
Right.
invested in phenotypical blackness and how that relates to a person's identity and their experiences and their place in this whole caste system, right? And so he says, Marcus is like, you look like another woman that I saw before that he got in a fight over and almost and killed that man over, but you're darker. She's darker than her. And it really struck me because, honestly, in Gaines's work, the uh figures of desirability and
Mm.
womanhood tend to be lighter.
Yeah.
And for her to be dark in that way, I thought that was really interesting. That's something we can unpack later, but or darker. I thought that was really interesting. And so he sort of, kind of playing with the trope there with where it's like the most desirable woman on the plantation is not even a fair woman, a Creole woman, but this is just a regular old black woman, right? And then when you think about Louise, you commented about how she's this like ghostly ethereal figure.
Yeah, and her and Marcus are both the first couple of times you see her, she's referred to like a ghost standing by the
Yeah.
gate.
And it's
And
almost
then
like that's related to how like the strength of her spirit, like she's almost not there because she's been beaten down and
right.
ignored and passed over. And she starts to, she doesn't speak really that
Nope.
much. How we hear of her thoughts is through other people, and that's something we should definitely talk about.
Well,
But
it's the mythological construction of the Southern white woman,
right.
which
And
which goes in with Pauline too. Go ahead, and then I'll say what I was going to say.
oh yeah, well, and then as the story goes along more, she gets thoughts, she gets opinions, she gets active. Like she's not passive anymore, she's active. She's almost aggressive towards the end, right? And so I think it's really interesting how in this idea of her as being this this delicate white woman is actually predicated on the fact that people just don't see her. Like she's literally not seen until she is. And so but it also talks about her as being very childlike
Mm-hmm.
and naive and almost immature, which you do see. But also she has a certain savviness to her, right? Because she's planning on betraying her husband in a way that will get her off the plantation. So she, in some way, she's scheming. She is scheming, and she further goes along and she schemes to get Marcus or any black man on that plantation to pay attention to her so she can start some trouble. So in some ways, she's not this innocent figure. She's this calculating figure because there's this line. I don't know if you remember the chapter. I don't have it in front of me, but they talk about how Marcus and Louise are watching each other and they are thinking how each other is
Mm-hmm.
thinking. It's
Yeah.
like, I thought that was really interesting. That
And,
kind
and,
of
and he's like, well, he does it with Marshall too. He's like,
like,
I know they were looking at each other because there's always eyes in Gaines too.
yes, yes.
So the tropes that I see a lot are a use of the eyes, not just in this novel, and men
Mhm.
crying. I mean, I've told you that before, but you see Marcus crying at multiple points.
Yes.
I think you see Bonbon crying,
Yeah.
but those moments where he's like, I saw them looking at each other, and this is what they were thinking. Like I knew
Right.
this. Specifically that one with Marshall that I remember.
Mhm. Well, I think, going back to like the structure of the narrative and how the story is told, the community is telling the story.
Right.
Like Jim as voice of community, but also the places where Jim can't go, someone in the community fills it in for him. Aunt Margaret, Son Brown, Bishop, all these other people. And when you think of a gathering of old men where that is made explicit, right? Each chapter is
Mm-hmm.
given to the character. So he's explicitly saying this is a collective narrative. In I'm sorry, in Love and Dust, you see that alluded to and expressed, but you don't see people get their own chapters. Like it's told, it's like Jim's narrating, but not really,
And
right?
that's one thing I love about this book. And you and I have talked about this before, and he's mentioned it. He said that Jim's based off of Nick Carraway from
Mm-hmm.
The Great Gatsby. So if you're
Yeah.
teaching this, you couldn't teach this you may be able to teach this in upper level high school. I was rereading, I was like, I'm not sure.
Mm.
There are other Gaines novels you could teach better than this one in high
Yeah.
school, but if you really wanted to think about it, you could pair this with Gatsby and look at the ways that he does those narrations. And they're not
Mm-hmm.
exactly the same
Mm-hmm.
stories.
Mm-hmm.
We know that, but to see how he kind of draws stylistically on Carraway, and then you also see him drawing on Hemingway, as we know too.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but that stylistic approach is one thing that's always kind of got me with this novel. And unless he doesn't, unless before dying too,
Mm-hmm.
he slips seamlessly, and you forget that you're not reading Jim. You're
Right.
reading basically second or
Right.
third hand information from somebody else
That's
who saw
right.
what happened.
That's right. And it's a lot of people. It's a lot of different people.
Right.
And what happens when you do that is
And
that okay, go ahead. Yeah.
well, I'll just say that the other thing too is the community. Because I
Mm.
started noticing that more here too, because everybody's worried about what's going to happen in the community, but it's the whole community within the story, as in all of Gaines's books.
Right.
And it's just presented in a different way here.
Well, and and when you tell the story from those different perspectives, it slips, right?
Mm-hmm.
So our connection to the truth and what really happened slips more and more because okay, we have Jim as this firsthand account. It's his perspective, but then he has to rely on these other perspectives to get their accounts. And so we get what they thought happened through the lens of what Jim
Right.
is saying to the reader. And I think that's so fascinating because one of the things that I was thinking about a lot was so if you wanted to talk about the dynamics of the couples, both Pauline and Bonbon and Louise and Marcus, one thing that you get is you are not getting a firsthand account of these relationships at all. Like
Mm-mm.
you are not the coitus, not the sexual engagements. You're not getting the flirtation. You're not getting any of that
Right.
firsthand account. You're sort of, and then you're placed in the minds of these characters through Jim and the community. And so the community is narrating these relationships, which to me, this is where it gets interesting. I'm wondering if the disdain and uncomfortableness with the nature of the relationships, obviously they're interracial and that's taboo, obviously, and the community is worried about the equilibrium that for all of the messed up dynamics the plantation has, it's still like steady, right? They know how to think about Aunt Margaret, think about Bishop. They know how to navigate, and even Jim, these spaces if there's no trouble, if everything is,
Right.
on the level. But these relationships and definitely Marcus and Louise's destabilize that. And so the community's, own disdain and distaste for these relationships is partially based on the fear of that equilibrium being disrupted and there being like in with regards to Louise and Marcus, there could be a hanging, there could be a riot, there could be lynchings, there could be terror. When it comes to Pauline and Bonbon, part of the disdain is the nature of Bonbon's behavior before that, right? He's
Mm-hmm.
this overseer taking advantage of multiple people, multiple women on the plantation, but also they understand that Pauline's in this weird position where she's getting things, right? Access to the kitchen space. She kicked Julie Rand out the kitchen
Yes.
because she's sleeping with Bonbon and he's access to power. So there's sort of this level of like, I don't want to say jealousy, but discussed that her ability to maneuver that way and use her sexuality in that way, but also the vulnerability that that sexuality presents to her, because they talked about she can't really claim Bonbon in that way. That's not her
And the
man.
kids can't.
That's not the father of her kids, and she honestly can't even ride around in the truck with him alone,
But
dressed in
there's something else to this too, though. The very first time we meet Julie Rand, what does she tell Marcus? Or where she ask him?
I don't remember.
Sorry. The first time when she meets Jim, when they talk, I think it's the first time when he goes to Baton Rouge.
Yeah.
So she's telling him about Marcus, all this stuff. There's a moment, I think, where she asks. Let me see if I can find it real quick. Before we even meet Pauline, before we even meet any of them, right? There's a moment where I think she says, "Do you think they'll ever be happy? Do you think they'll ever?"
Right.
And I think she's talking about. I think she's talking about him here, or maybe later. But she asked it. Other people ask it. Do you think that Pauline and Bonbon will ever make it? They'll ever get happy? And at the end, they do. I mean, they leave
where it ends.
Well,
yeah.
But that's kind of the question with Louise and Marcus too, and that's kind of the discussion too. Is one thing I was thinking about while you were talking is there's tragedy in this book, but is there hope that there is an option to be able to have these types of relationships?
I think that
there's discussion
that's a
of it and
complicated
questions.
question.
It is.
That's a complicated question, because I think I'm approaching it from the lens of what does the book say, right?
Yeah.
Not like what has society decided, but what does the book say?
Even with what the book says, is there a space for that hope? You talk about that domestic scene at the end, where they are basically, and you frame it as Marcus supplanting Bonbon, which is the case.
Yeah.
I'm not denying that. But you have that scene at the end where there is hope that this gap can be bridged. It's just the outward community, not just the community in the quarters, but Marshall's community that's keeping them from being able to achieve that. And the same thing with Pauline and Bonbon when they go to Baton Rouge, because there's all those references from Jim where he's like, she was talking to him like a wife would talk to a husband. There's all those kind of comments. That's the same thing you get in the domestic scene. So even within the confines of the book, is there hope? But that hope is just dashed.
Yeah, I mean, I think what the book sort of presents to us is that there's spaces where people can have that utopia, if you will, like that area where they can have that relationship dynamic, and there's spaces where you cannot. And so for example, Pauline and Bonbon, it's literally her house, like in her home, and in the kitchen, apparently, where they go together, and then also in Baton Rouge where they're in that room. And then for Louise and Marcus, it's literally in the house when Bonbon is not there.
Right.
And so like there's pockets of areas where there can be connection, relationships, intimacy, but in general, there's the community and sort of the society that will not allow that to extend outside these small spaces, like these secretive small spaces.
Right.
And so what I think about is like, hey, how can characters have intimacy? Like, what is Gaines's view of intimacy in this novel? And in a lot of ways, intimacy does not exist in the context of the narrative, because the storytelling does not allow for intimacy.
Well, I was about to ask that, because like you said, we don't see the intimacy. We don't see Marcus and Louise talking on the bed. We don't see the quiet moments apart from in the bar with Paul, or in the truck with Pauline and Bonbon. So we're left to fill in those gaps. So that hope kind of comes from us a little bit, I guess.
Right. And you know, you just brought up a really good point. The vision of the intimacy is filtered through other characters, right? So we have these moments in the text where people are imagining, like you said, what's going on. Like there's this part where, you know, Jim is relaying Bonbon and Pauline's sexual intimacy, and he's like saying these things, and it's like you didn't see that, like you're just sort of like layering on someone's, you know, observation, who were not in that bedroom space with them, right? Who is listening, and then you're relaying that to the reader through Jim. And so in a lot of ways, I would argue that these relationships are almost incapable of having true intimacy in the context of the novel, because we as the reader do not have access to that. The community does not allow these characters to have that intimacy. And I would say in some ways, these relationships almost function in the context of the community, because the community almost possesses them, if that makes sense. You could argue that they do that because of the threat that these relationships pose to the communities. I mean, it's like I said earlier, it's obvious what Marcus and Louise's relationship, the threat of that relationship, right? Like the threat of a white woman and a black man getting together and, God forbid, running off together, like that completely
With the
destabilizes
kid.
With the kid, with the white kid, destabilizes all of Southern rules and patriarchy, right? Like it just does. But when you look at, now you go back and you look at Pauline and Bonbon's relationship, there's a level of instability there too, because in much of Gaines's work, and it's in this text, it's like, okay, Bonbon's allowed to sleep with whoever he wants and nobody should say a thing
And
about it.
Pauline can't.
Well, Pauline, if she's chosen, she has to comply, right?
That's my point.
Yeah. However, there's a rule. Bonbon's not supposed to love her. He's just supposed to use her sexually. When he falls in love with her, he violates the rule. And we know that he violates that rule because he starts spending more time with her than he does his wife.
Well, Jim explains it in those
Yeah.
terms.
Yeah. And he's like loving his children. He doesn't claim them because that's a bridge too far, but he does a lot for them and he spends time. And so he exhibits actual deep connection and love for these Black people, right? And that's not what he's supposed to do.
And
And
I guess
so the Cajuns mention that. They're like, you're neglecting your wife. This is affecting your child. You're not following the rules. So that is destabilizing also the dynamics of the society when you actually dare to love this woman and her children.
And I think that's where I think about the hope.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're actually doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And they are doing it, like you said, even though we don't see the rooms, they are doing it openly.
Yeah,
I mean, especially with Pauline and Bonbon, and like you said, that bridge too far is him loving her.
Mm-hmm.
And with Marcus and Louise, nobody knows about it except for Aunt Margaret and Jim starting off. But then he tells everybody we're running away, right? Like I think he tells Pauline or somebody else too, so they know it. Mm-hmm. It's open, even though, but it is that shattering of the rules. Gaines calls it the rules all the time too. But when I was thinking about hope, I had this mark. I just saw it on 270. Because talking about Jim, his kind of shift in the way he views Marcus is important, because he says, I admired what he was doing. And this is when he wanted to go back and see him before he left, but he missed him. I wanted to tell him how brave I thought he was. He was the bravest man I knew, the bravest man I'd ever met. And of course, that's Gaines with his repetitions. Yes, I wanted to tell him that. And I wanted to tell Louise how I admired her bravery. I think that's important too. But this is what I had marked with hope. I wanted to tell them that they were starting something. Yes, that's what I would tell them. They were starting something that others would hear about and understand and would follow.
Right.
And it's not necessarily a hope that they're going to be able to do it, but it's a hope because it changes him and causes him to act too.
Right. I think that's a really good point. It causes him to act, but the act that he takes is he leaves, right? He's
like, kind of pushed off too, though.
Yeah, right. It's suggested to him that he leave,
but he does
ready to leave.
He denies Marshall.
Yes, he does.
I mean, Marshall tries to give him a letter and he's like, no, I'm good.
He rejects that. And in a lot of ways, what he's saying is he's rejecting the dynamics of all of this, and he doesn't accept any of this because Jim is a character who has integrity. Like he has integrity. So he's like, I don't believe in this anymore. I don't want to uphold this anymore. I'm gone. And I think that he sees in Marcus in some ways, and that's something maybe we could talk about, and in Louise, some measure of integrity. I think he sees integrity there and he admires that because he's like, you know what? Marcus may have started and Louise may have started off trying to be devious and start trouble. And it may have been, coming from a sinister and frustrated place, but they got to a place where they actually genuinely cared for each other. And they actually wanted to live a life together. They wanted to maintain a level of integrity and they wanted to do it. They didn't accept the confines of the plantation. They were going to leave. Whereas in some ways, Pauline and Bonbon are like just accepting that the situation and they're trying to make do. You sort of see Pauline have to like swallow a lot of things so she can have that relationship with Bon Bon. Um, and I think that's like, you know, the where they talk about how she has to ask Jim to and you know
Yeah.
Bon Bon asked Jim to ride with them, and she has to pretend to be with Jim, and you know she doesn't feel like doing that, and she has to, you know, ask around and do things to maintain that relationship. And I think Jim really was frustrated by that coupling because they were dragging him in to their relationship so they could maintain it. Remember, he's the one that has to go to DeLong and ask about the Roman, and he's like, I'm not doing that.
Well,
And
it's the
he's the one
same
that has
thing
to pretend to be that.
that I was going to mention that scene, but it's the same thing with Louise and Marcus too. Aunt Margaret's like, I'm in it.
Right.
I can't do anything.
Right.
I didn't think about that. It's the same exact thing. But that scene, I was just thinking about that scene in the hotel or whatever you want to call it, bar.
Mm.
And he's like, no, I'm not going to go do it. And he talks about Bon Bon being scared. He's like, he doesn't know how to talk to people, right? He doesn't know how to
Right.
talk to a black business owner.
He
Like he
doesn't
knows how to
know.
talk to me and work me, but he doesn't know how to talk to him, right? I
Right.
think that's a
Well,
really important kind of scene too.
he won't, and I don't want to use the term lower, he won't humble himself
I think
to go to that
lower
man.
works,
Yeah. Well,
but
but you know,
humble's better.
he won't humble himself to talk to that man and ask for what he wants, because what he wants, for two reasons. Number one, he does not know how to ask a black man for anything.
Right.
Right, like that's a problem. Okay, like he does not know how to go to a black man, and he won't even ask really Jim for anything. Right, so he does not know how to talk to a black person without ordering them around.
Right.
Right, so we understand that. Number two, and he knows he can't order this man around because, as you said quite eloquently, he's a black business owner.
Right.
Like, you know, and Bon Bon, for all his many schemes and accomplishments on the plantation, doesn't own a
Accomplishments.
business. Right, so he doesn't, so he's not, he knows sort of like in, you know, inside that he's not, you know, he's at a disadvantage here. Also, you're in Baton Rouge, that's a city. Bon Bon's a country dude, right? You know, so there's that dynamic. However, another reason he cannot humble himself, right? He won't humble himself, is I believe in some ways he believes he's already been humbled because he is in love with this woman. So he's already like in this vulnerable position. You see in that scene, I thought it was really interesting because it's like he's already vulnerable to Pauline
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of ways, and he's resenting being vulnerable to her people. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? Like, because he knows he has to go amongst the black people to be with her. He can't take her and flaunt her around the white people in their face.
Well,
He
and
can't.
yet, yeah, this is
You
this
know?
isn't Placage in New Orleans where you can have her out on Rampart
Right.
Street.
Right. And so in some ways, like, you know, he's by loving her, he has to denounce not only his white culture and all of that and his people that he knows, but he also has to denounce his, not to overuse a word we've like run into the ground these days, but privilege. Like when he's in that bar, he has no privilege,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
He doesn't really have that. And so in that scene, when he's at the bar and he's seething probably and frustrated, and he's mad because Jim won't do his bidding. He's stuck. He is literally stuck. And you see Pauline sort of like rub his wrist and try to drag him out because she knows why he's upset. She knows what position he's in. And you sort of see her have to like be this person who has to understand and relate to this man's moods, and not only his moods but the reason why he's upset. And he's upset because she knows he can't flex, you know, in a lot of ways. And so it's a fascinating scene. It's an interesting scene when you understand what's really going on there and you understand what Jim is rejecting. Jim, in a lot of ways, really does not respect Bon Bon in that moment because he's like, if you, and because he says that he cannot go to that man and ask that man for a room and be with that woman. He can't do it. And you can see Jim sort of feel like, mm, I can't respect you because you want me to carry that water for you because you won't come hat in hand to that black man and ask for that room because you are on his territory and in his turf and you're with her people and I'm part of her people and I'm part of all of this. So it's sort of like he loves Pauline, but like at what point will he humble himself to that love and just like ask for, be humble to another black man, another black person? And I think that when you say hope and you're like, can they make it? I feel like it's going to be difficult
It
because
will. No matter
Bonbon,
where they're at, just like Aunt Margaret says with Elise and Marcus, no matter
yeah.
where you go, it's still gonna be difficult.
But Bonbon's going to struggle because on the plantation, he's secure
Yep.
in that relationship and his identity. Off of it, he becomes destabilized. So they leave the plantation. It's going to be difficult because his identity is destabilized in a lot of ways. And so is he going to be able to navigate the world? It's okay for him to break all these rules on the plantation because he's still who he is and he has that power. But outside of that, it's going to be difficult. And if they have to live among Black people, that is a mess. That's a mess. And so
I'm
it's
thinking
really interesting to think about.
I'm thinking about Alice Childress. Alice Childress is The Wedding Band,
Mm-hmm.
which the white guy in that doesn't have an issue with where they go, but it's the Black community that has an issue with the woman bringing them in.
Right.
But we need to start wrapping up, and there's a couple of things I kind of want to get to. And before I get to the kind of the last three things, what do you make of the end? Because I picked up on the end this time in that last sentence. And this is, of course, when Jim is walking away, and we don't have to get too much into Aunt Margaret and Bishop and the differences between them and Marcus and Jim, because you talk about some in your essay. But he says, I picked up a suitcase and the handbag and walked away. When I looked over my shoulder, I saw her walking back home. And he's talking about Aunt Margaret. I find it really interesting that he uses the word home for her. And I don't know totally what to make of it without going off for an hour, but what do you kind of make of that, if anything?
That he calls that place home. That's good. That's really good that you brought that up because I think about that a lot.
And I'm thinking it's her home, not his, though.
Right, but he
I'm
says
not sure you think about that. Right.
But he says home, And I mean, that's actually really good.
And he's not from there either.
No.
He's only been there a few years.
I that's making me really think about that because the constructions of home, I mean, that there's a whole like the whole thing. And there's a whole discourse about that. What it mean, what does home mean, especially like for like African Americans and diasporic people and all that. But that's interesting that even though that place is toxic, the plantation is completely toxic and it's completely dysfunctional and it's completely oppressive, that I think home is where you know who you are and how to navigate it. It's where in some ways you're comfortable. And so yes, he's leaving, but I think when he says home, he's saying we understand what leaving means in that moment, because as messed up as the plantation dynamics are, he knows everybody on there.
He has a community.
He's familiar. Like he has a place, he has status in some ways. Like it is his home, and home is where you fit in, and maybe not fit in, but where where you understand things. And so the reason he stayed for so long, because remember he had a little boo and she left.
Yep.
He stayed there because that he knew the intricacies of the plantation. Billie Jean, he knew that place, and I think when he says home, I think what we are meant to process is there's a level of like sorrow and sadness and bittersweetness in that moment because he's leaving a place where he may not love it, but he knows it. And in some ways that's a form of love. And I think it's familiar, and he's going out and striking out on the unfamiliar because now home is no longer tenable. It's no longer safe for him. He has to go. And I think by saying that that's home, I think we understand the break that becomes, like how kind of bittersweet that is for him, but also home is not always comfortable and cozy, but it's what you know. Right. It's what you know. And there's reasons why people don't leave. I think that's the thing that I'm left with Gaines. I think you and I've talked about this a lot. What does it take for people to leave a bad situation? What does it take for people to leave a place where they're oppressed and where they're doing whatever? And when I taught A Gathering of Old Men, and I think we talked about this the last time we kind of discussed that novel, these are the people who didn't leave during the Great Migration, and if they did go to war or they did have other experiences, they came back. I mean, you think about Grant and you think about Jackson and you think about them returning. They return because it's home, but that doesn't mean it's great. But it's home, right?
Well, I was just reading,
I
was just reading about Imani Perry's new book, and she talks about wanting to be back home, right? Not in the book. I haven't read the book yet, but the article in Bitter Southerner, and that's Gaines too. Like when I was
Mhm.
reading that, I was like, this is Gaines because he went to California. We haven't talked about his personal stuff, which is so much connected with this.
Mhm.
But he moved to California with his parents and, 40, right after the war, when he was a teenager. And then he kept trying to write and he didn't start writing until he started coming back home. And I think
Right.
that discussion of home is really important. I like what you said. And I
Mhm.
also think, like you said, that brings out the community aspect,
Mhm.
which the community is huge within Gaines's work because that's why he says he writes. Some of the stuff we found in the archive, and he basically says, I write because I must. If I don't tell their stories, who will? That's
Mhm.
essentially what he says. And this was just in a notebook that he wrote like on a train, probably, something like that.
Mhm.
But that's his whole thing. And he writes about individuals who didn't grow up. I mean, Miss
Mhm.
Jane Pittman's the prime example of who
Yeah.
weren't in the thick of the civil rights movement. How did the civil rights movement hit rural Louisiana, right? There were things in Baton Rouge, but this is outside of Baton Rouge,
Right.
like on a cutoff of the Mississippi River in the middle of nowhere, basically,
Mhm.
with some good food, though.
Right. Right.
So
Well,
those types of things.
I think about him coming back. Like I was talking about it with my brother, and I said, he lived all these places and he came back to Louisiana and he didn't leave after that. Like and he went back, not he came back to Lafayette, but he ended up retiring out in Point Coupee. Like he
On
really
the plantation where he
on
grew
the
up,
plantation where he grew up. And
and that's
and then
where he's
he had
buried.
church, right? He relocated to this place. It's like the tie to that space was mystical, it's like deep. And I'm kind of thinking about those things myself because I grew up, in
Yeah,
Lafayette, and I no longer live in Lafayette. And I know that I probably won't live in Lafayette again, but that place has a very big hold on me. And part of it is because it's what I know.
right. And
It's
see,
what you know.
that's where we differ because Bossier does not have a hold on me,
Right.
but Lafayette does.
Mm,
To a certain extent,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
I haven't looked up research on all the studies of what you're talking about home and what it means, but I've thought about it a lot
Mm,
because I really thought about it when we were in Norway and people were asking where are you from, and then when I moved here and
mhm,
people are like, where are you from?
mhm,
So I'm like, how do you answer that? I'm like, we spent a year in Norway, we spent 2 years in Auburn, Alabama, we spent 7
mhm.
in Lafayette, we spent so where do you get back to actually where that home is, right? And I think that home is, like you said, that community, that people that
Yes,
and I
that
think
you know the
that's possibly
best.
why
Yeah.
Lafayette.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a really good point because, like, for me, it's where I grew up. But I mean, it's part of my desire to be in New Orleans was because I spent 4 years here in undergrad and I felt really a tied to there too. But you're right. Like, home is what you know the best. It's where you feel like your most self. And it may not necessarily be good or bad, but it's what you know? And I think, like you said, it may not be where you were born or where you're originally from, but it's the place where you have the deepest tie to,
Right.
you know, that deepest tie. And I think, at the end of Love and Dust, he has this. He's like you said, he's not from there, but he has this deep tie to that space, and that's why it's home.
So there's three things I want to wrap up with. So just bear with me
Hmm.
for a second. One thing we did not talk about, which of course we could have talked about, and I do have a link on the thing about it, is actually why Marcus is on the plantation in the first place.
Right. Hmm.
And it is the convict lease system. And
Hmm.
you remember at points, and he says that Louise is in slavery too,
Mm.
which is abolitionist, white women abolitionist language from the antebellum period. I would
Hmm.
also say white women language from this period, because Lillian Smith doesn't use the term slavery, but she presents the white woman on the pedestal kind of like that, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
um and I think that's important language that he describes Louise as being in slavery too. And if she's in slavery, and we haven't talked about, but if she's in slavery to that myth of that white Southern woman who
Yes.
is on a pedestal, who is virginal,
Yes.
who is all of that stuff, right?
Yes.
But the 13th Amendment, abolished slavery. And this is on your
Mhm.
syllabus.
Mhm.
But if you read the amendment, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, this clause right here, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, which is
Mhm.
Marcus, shall exist within the US or any place subject to their jurisdiction. This is what Marcus is under.
Mhm.
And this is, if you've watched the documentary 13th about mass incarceration, moving from slavery to mass incarceration, it's free on YouTube. you know this discussion, but if you haven't, I would suggest go watch it, because it traces this and actually talks about the convict lease system too. But he talks about at multiple points that I'm a slave here, or we said a couple of points that this is slavery, right? And Miss Jane Pittman in the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman says that sharecropping is slavery. It's just another form.
Yeah.
So the ways that things change, it stay the same. The other thing I want to point out to you too is that while Jennifer and I were at the Ernest Gaines Center, we actually, this has changed up a little bit. We started a LibGuide with all of Gaines's works. So here's actually one, I'll put this on Canvas. This is actually the one for Of Love and Dust. And if you wanted to teach it, right, we have actually questions for you to consider. We have possible activities, a quote from him, and just some materials, right? I did a whole post about these international covers of Love and Dust. Yeah. These are both French covers, by the way. And
what are you gonna do?
No comment, but this one really gets me. This is a French cover of Love and Dust, and it really is a pastoral image. It just, and he's widely read in France.
Yeah.
And then I think that they've recently added the quotes to consider, which I think is good. The other thing I want to point out to you too, if you come over here, one thing that you can teach, like I said, this may be a difficult teach in middle or definitely middle school, maybe even high school, but you can teach A Lesson Before Dying, Gathering of All Men, and Pittman, but also say teach The Sky is Gray. The Sky is Gray is probably one of the best short stories ever. And it's really kind of an important short story. And looking at style, I think is really good with this. Another thing too, which we're not going to talk about, but just to mention briefly, I think he had one version of Love and Dust where Marcus and Louise got away.
Yeah.
So how would that have changed it? Just we don't have to talk about that, but
yeah,
just for students who hopefully you've watched this long. But I wanted to end with this and show you one thing on Bloodline, because you started by talking about how oral this is. Did y'all read the whole book out loud? You and your sister and mom?
I love it. Yeah, I read the whole book
out loud.
Out loud, I did.
Wow. I kind of felt it was stilted when she was reading out loud a little bit, but we did like the first couple of chapters.
Right.
Okay. But I think that's Hemingway's kind of influence and just that. But one thing here that I wanted to show you, I think it's Bloodline. Yeah. These letters from Alice Walker. And of course, Alice Walker from Eatonton, from Georgia, Meridian, Color Purple, all that. These are letters that she wrote to Gaines in 1969. And one thing that she says in here, she talks about Catherine Carmier, which we mentioned. She talks about The Sky is Gray. And I think it's here. It may be here, but she talks about in here how she loves the way that Gaines writes dialect. The rural Louisiana, right here. South Louisiana's written poet. I can't read her whole thing. But she loves how he writes the speech and the dialect that Jennifer was talking about earlier. And she wants to be able to write Middle Georgia speech and dialect the same way for her people, right? I think that's a very important kind of thing. And going back to kind of the discussion too of Fitzgerald, the way that writers take influence and use influence, I think is important. Something we didn't talk about, but something very important that I've done work on with Gaines. I know that you have too, and all of that. So thank you for taking an hour out of your time to talk with us today.
Well, I could talk about Gaines all day. So
yeah, we could, as you were talking, I was like, we could go 2 or 3 hours, just you and me.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's how it goes.
Yeah.